Black Pine Campground officially closed on October 11th. Most people imagine a campground closing with a locked gate and an empty parking lot, but that's never how it happens. Even after the last reservation checks out, rangers spend days walking every campsite, making sure nobody left anything behind. Every season is the same. Someone forgets a lantern hanging from a tree, a fishing pole leaning against a picnic table, a cooler tucked beneath a tarp, or a sleeping bag stuffed behind a log. Most of it ends up sitting on a shelf in the ranger station until someone eventually calls, asking if anything was turned in. Eric had worked at Black Pine for nearly 12 years, and the cleanup was always his favorite part of the season. Once the campers were gone, the forest felt completely different. The laughter disappeared. The smell of campfires faded. By the third morning, the only sounds left were the wind moving through the pines and the occasional raven somewhere overhead. It felt like the mountain finally belonged to itself again. Site 18 sat near the northern edge of the campground where the trees grew thicker and the gravel road curved into a quiet loop before turning back towards the entrance. Families liked it because it felt secluded without being isolated. It had a large picnic table, a stone fire ring, and enough flat ground for 2 tents. Eric almost walked right past it. The campsite was unusually clean. The fire ring had already been shoveled out. There weren't any food wrappers blowing through the grass or empty cans tucked beneath the table. A thin layer of damp pine needles had already started collecting across the clearing. It wasn't until he reached his truck that something caught his eye. A folded campground map rested on the middle of the picnic table. One corner lifted slightly every time the wind blew. He walked back to grab it before the rain ruined it. When he picked it up, there was a disposable camera underneath. It looked almost new. The cardboard label had faded after sitting outside for several days, but the plastic body wasn't cracked, and the thumb wheel still clicked firmly when he tested it. Eric smiled to himself. Somebody's going to be sick when they realize they left this. He tore off a strip of masking tape from the glove compartment of his truck, wrote Site 18 across it with a marker, stuck it to the front of the camera, and tossed it into the passenger seat. That should have been the end of it. Lost property wasn't unusual. People almost always called within a day or two after getting home. A phone charger, a fishing tackle box, a child's stuffed animal. Sooner or later, someone always realized something was missing. Nobody ever called about the camera. By the following Friday, it was still sitting on a shelf in the ranger station beside a pair of hiking boots, an insulated water bottle, and a bundle of forgotten tent stakes. Another week passed. Still nothing. One afternoon, Eric drove into the nearby town of Mill Haven to pick up supplies. Before heading back to the campground, he stopped at the small pharmacy downtown. It was one of the last places in the county that still developed disposable cameras. The teenager behind the counter picked it up and laughed. "I haven't seen one of these in years." "Neither have I," Eric said. "You want digital copies too?" Eric shook his head. "If somebody comes looking for it, they'll probably just want the pictures." The kid slipped the camera into a yellow envelope. 4 or 5 days. Eric almost forgot about it. When the pharmacy finally called, he picked up the envelope on his lunch break. He sat in his truck for a minute before driving back to the campground, mostly out of curiosity. There were 27 photographs. The first showed 2 pickup trucks backed into Site 18 with both tailgates open. Camping gear covered the ground between them. Folding chairs, coolers, a bright red canoe resting upside down in the grass. The second photograph showed a woman laughing as she struggled to force tent poles into the ground. Whoever had taken the picture had clearly chosen the worst possible moment because she was looking straight at the camera with an expression that said, "If you don't stop taking pictures and help me, you're sleeping outside." Eric laughed. He'd seen that exact look hundreds of times. The third photograph showed a golden retriever launching off the dock after a stick. The fourth was a close-up of muddy hiking boots drying beside the fire after what had obviously been a rainy afternoon. The fifth showed coffee brewing in a dented metal pot while morning fog drifted across the lake. As he continued flipping through the stack, The people in the photograph slowly started to feel familiar. There were 6 of them: an older couple, a younger couple, a teenage boy, a little girl who couldn't have been older than 8. The dog somehow found his way into nearly every picture. One photograph showed the little girl asleep in a folding chair with a half-eaten marshmallow still clutched in her hand. Another showed the teenage boy proudly holding up a trout that looked much too small to justify the grin on his face. There was a picture of everyone sitting around the fire, laughing so hard that 2 of them had their heads thrown back. Eric found himself smiling. He didn't know any of these people, but after 21 photographs, it almost felt like he did. He understood why people still bought disposable cameras. Nobody worried about taking the perfect picture. Nobody stopped to check the lighting. Nobody deleted the bad ones. They simply captured moments. Then he reached photograph number 22. The smile slowly disappeared from his face. At first, he couldn't figure out what felt wrong. It was the same campsite, the same tents, the same fire. Then he realized it wasn't the subject of the photograph that bothered him. It was where it had been taken from. Every picture before it had been taken from inside the campsite. This one hadn't. Whoever was holding the camera was standing several yards back in the woods. Pine branches filled the edges of the frame. The campsite sat beyond them, lit only by the last orange glow of a dying campfire. Both tents were zipped shut. Nobody was awake. Eric turned the photograph over. 22. He looked at the remaining stack in his hand. 5 photographs were left. Eric spread the remaining photographs across his desk instead of flipping through them one at a time. Whatever had changed, he wanted to see the entire sequence. Photograph 22 showed the campsite sometime after midnight. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, throwing just enough light across the clearing to outline the tents. Both were zipped shut. Nobody was awake. At first glance, nothing looked unusual. Then he realized why the image bothered him. Every photograph before it had been taken from inside the campsite. Whoever had been holding the camera was always standing beside the fire, near the picnic table, or somewhere close to the tents. This one wasn't. The photographer had stepped into the woods. Pine branches filled the edges of the frame, almost as if whoever was holding the camera was trying to hide behind them. The campsite wasn't the subject anymore. It was being watched. Eric reached for the next photograph. This one had been taken from even farther away. The tents looked smaller now, almost swallowed by the darkness beyond the firelight. More branches blocked the view, forcing anyone looking at the picture to peer through the trees just to see the campsite. He frowned. Maybe one of the campers had gone for a walk before bed. It wasn't impossible. But then he picked up photograph 24. The angle had changed completely. The photographer wasn't farther away anymore. They'd moved. The campsite was now being viewed from the opposite side of the clearing. Eric knew Site 18 well enough to picture exactly where the camera had been standing. There wasn't a trail there, just thick forest. He picked up photograph 25. The campsite was barely visible now. Instead, the camera was aimed almost entirely at the larger of the 2 tents. The flap hadn't been zipped completely shut, leaving only a narrow opening. Through it, just barely visible in the orange glow of the dying fire, was the outline of someone sleeping inside. Eric instinctively brought the photograph closer to his face. It wasn't blurry. Whoever had taken it hadn't been snapping quick pictures while walking. They'd stopped, focused, waited. He slowly set it back on the desk. Photograph 26 showed the fire pit from behind an enormous white pine near the edge of the clearing. The trunk filled nearly half the frame. It looked as though the photographer had stepped behind it, leaned out just long enough to press the shutter, and then disappeared behind the tree again. Eric recognized that tree immediately. He'd walked past it hundreds of times over the years. Without thinking, he stood up, walked over to the large campground map hanging on the wall, and traced his finger to Site 18. The tree was still marked on the survey map, exactly where he remembered it. He returned to his desk and picked up the final photograph. Morning light filtered softly through the trees. The trucks were gone, the tents had been packed away, the folding chairs had disappeared. The fire ring was cold. The campsite looked exactly the way Eric had found it several weeks earlier. Empty, quiet, almost untouched. Except for one thing. A disposable camera sat alone in the middle of the picnic table. The same camera Eric was holding in his hand. He looked from the photograph to the camera and back again. The masking tape was still attached to the front. Site 18. He turned the photograph over. Number 27. The final exposure on the roll. Eric absent-mindedly pressed the shutter button on the camera. Nothing happened. He tried advancing the thumb wheel. It wouldn't move. The film had been completely used. He stared at the photograph again. The camera sitting on the picnic table couldn't possibly have taken the picture it appeared in. For the first time since opening the envelope, Eric stopped trying to explain what he was seeing. He slid the photographs back into their envelope, grabbed his truck keys, and drove straight to Black Pine Campground. Site 18 looked exactly as it had in the photograph. The picnic table hadn't moved. Neither had the fire ring. A fresh layer of pine leaves covered the clearing where the tents had once stood. Eric walked toward the large white pine he'd recognized in photograph 26. Once he reached it, he raised the picture in front of him and slowly lined it up with the landscape. Every detail matched. The tree, the fire ring, the picnic table. The photographer had been standing in this exact spot. Eric lowered the photograph and looked at the ground beneath his boots. Something immediately caught his attention. The forest floor everywhere else was covered in pine needles. Here, the dirt was bare. Not from erosion, not from animals. It looked as though someone had stood in that exact spot over and over again, wearing the ground smooth while facing the campsite. Eric didn't mention the worn patch of ground to anyone that afternoon. There wasn't anything illegal about standing in the woods, and he knew exactly how the conversation would go if he called the sheriff. Someone had wandered off the trail, taken a few strange pictures, and left. It was unsettling, but it wasn't a crime. Even so, he couldn't stop thinking about the photographs. Back at the ranger station, he pulled the reservation records for the final weekend Black Pine had been open. Site 18 had been reserved by Daniel for 3 nights. 6 guests, 1 dog. There was also a phone number listed on the reservation form. Eric stared at it for a moment before picking up the phone. The man answered on the 3rd ring. After introducing himself, Eric explained that he found a disposable camera while cleaning Site 18 after the campground closed. There was a brief silence before Daniel laughed. "I was wondering if anyone had found it. My daughter cried the entire drive home because she thought we'd lost all our camping pictures." Eric smiled. "Well, I actually had the film developed." "You did?" "I figured if someone eventually called looking for the camera, you'd probably care more about the photos than the camera itself." Daniel thanked him several times before they agreed to meet the following afternoon at the ranger station. That night, Eric looked through the photographs again. This time, he wasn't looking at the people. He was looking at the little details. The older pickup truck had a dent above the rear wheel. The little girl wore the same yellow rain jacket in almost every picture. The golden retriever had a bright orange collar with a reflective strip. There was a blue enamel coffee mug sitting on the picnic table in several of the early photographs. The more he studied them, the more familiar the family became. They weren't strangers anymore. They were just people who'd spent a quiet weekend in the mountains, completely unaware that something about those last 6 photographs didn't make sense. The following afternoon, a silver SUV rolled into the ranger station parking lot. Daniel stepped out first, followed by his wife, their 2 children, and the same golden retriever from the photographs. The dog immediately started sniffing around the parking lot, while the little girl laughed and tried to keep up with him. Eric welcomed them inside and placed the envelope on the desk. "I figured these belong with you." Daniel smiled as he opened it. The family gathered around, passing the photographs between them. They laughed at the picture of the muddy dog. The teenage boy groaned when he saw the photo of himself proudly holding the tiny trout. Daniel's wife rolled her eyes when the half-built tent appeared. "I told you to delete that one." Daniel laughed. "Good thing disposable cameras don't let you do that." For a few minutes, everything felt exactly the way Eric had hoped it would. A family was getting back memories they thought were gone forever. Then Daniel reached photograph 22. His smile disappeared. He studied it for several seconds before handing it to his wife. Neither of them spoke. Eric watched their expressions change as they silently flipped through the remaining 5 photographs. Finally, Daniel looked up. "Where did you say you found the camera?" "On the picnic table at Site 18. Daniel nodded slowly. Then he looked back down at the photographs. "These last ones," he hesitated, "they aren't ours." "What do you mean?" Daniel laid photograph 6 beside photograph 22. "They look almost identical." "They are," Eric said. Daniel shook his head. "No." He pointed to the first photograph. "Our big tent was green." Then he pointed to photograph 22. "This tent is blue." Eric leaned closer. Daniel was right. He'd been so focused on where the pictures had been taken that he never really looked at what they were showing. Now the differences seemed obvious. The folding chairs weren't the same. The lantern hanging beside the picnic table was gone. The red canoe had disappeared. Even the cooler besides the fire ring was a different shape. Every campsite at Black Pine had the same layout, and in the darkness, he'd assumed he was looking at Site 18. He wasn't. Somewhere between photograph 21 and photograph 22, the camera had stopped documenting Daniel's camping trip. It had started documenting someone else's. Daniel asked if he could keep the first 21 photographs. Eric told him they were his. When Daniel reached for the last 6, he stopped. "I don't want those." He pushed them back across the desk. "They're not ours." After the family left, Eric couldn't stop thinking about the second campsite. The reservation records showed that Site 19 had been occupied that same weekend by another family. They checked out Monday morning just like everyone else. No missing persons, no emergency calls, nothing unusual. Still, something about those photographs refused to leave him alone. A few months later, the county began digitizing old park records, including recovered photographs. Every image was rescanned at a much higher resolution than the original prints. One afternoon, the technician handling the scans called Eric. "You should come take a look at something." When Eric arrived, the technician had photograph number 3 on the monitor. It was one of the ordinary pictures. The golden retriever running into the lake. "There," the technician said, pointing toward the tree line. At first, Eric didn't see anything. Then the image sharpened. A person, standing between 2 trees, far enough away that they disappeared into the background of the original print. The technician opened another photograph. The figure was there again. Different position, same distance, then another, and another. As they worked through the photographs, a pattern began to appear. The figure wasn't just standing in one place. They were moving, slowly circling the campsite, always staying just inside the trees, always watching. Eric counted them. Out of the first 21 photographs, the figure appeared in 18. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, the technician opened the last photograph, the empty campsite. The disposable camera resting on the picnic table. Instead of zooming toward the table, he zoomed toward the woods where the picture had been taken. Another figure slowly came into focus, standing only a few feet behind the photographer, watching the person who was taking the picture. The room fell silent. Eric looked from one figure to the other. For months, he'd believed the mystery was the last 6 photographs. He'd been wrong. The family hadn't been photographed after they fell asleep. They'd been watched from the moment they arrived.